There we go. Okay, so thanks for the invitation. It was a very nice pleasure to come here, visit a new city, and enjoy these intellectual debates over 2 days. What I'm going to talk to, I was thinking about what to talk about today, about the Brexit process. And at the end of the day, I decided to basically structure my talk in 2 very different parts. Because I said maybe it's more useful or more interesting if I report what we've been researching on Brexit in the last 2 years. So basically we have a project at Loughborough, mainly at Loughborough University, basically funded by the UK in a Changing Europe. And then, so this research has different strands, and what I've said, maybe it's good for me to report back some of the findings of this research. The research is basically 2 different areas, as I was saying. One is the Brexit negotiations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you achieve so far unity in the Brexit negotiations, and I focus pretty much mainly on the role of the European Parliament in the process because it's where I mainly did primary research. And then second, very different, but I think listening to the presentations yesterday, also to Simon's speech, it might be interesting also to report back another strand of our research, is basically how was Brexit perceived and used by European political parties in the continent. So, and focusing mainly on 2 types of parties, right-wing populist parties in Europe, how did they react to Brexit, and mainstream parties in Europe. This is research which is ongoing. So how did mainstream parties in Europe react to Brexit? So 2 very different topics, but I hope I will relay back some information. Then, okay, so let's start with unity in the EU in the Brexit negotiation. So we realized, okay, the EU was quite united so far in what in the previous era was called phase 1, like the divorce. So at the end of the day, but was it easy for the EU to achieve unity here? Already back then in 2016, there were people, oh yeah, Brexit might lead to a domino effect in Europe. So the question is, yeah, the EU was able to achieve unity, but how easy was that? Clearly, for big parties, it was pretty easy. Come on, it's like asking more money to the Brits. So give us more money. Who's against it? Or citizens' rights. Again, giving more rights possibly as rights as possible to EU citizens in the UK and vice versa. Who's against it? So it was pretty easy to achieve unity on that side. But maybe I'll have a caveat here. There were other crises in the meantime, very, very acute crises. There was the migration crisis, pretty much the same time, and the Europeans were not able to, and maybe member states, because the European Parliament finalized positions on immigration, how to reform migration in Europe. But the member states were clearly not able to achieve any position on migration. The Eurozone reform, pretty much the same. And then there were like a lot of talks about how governments, or populist governments, like Italy, could react to Brexit. There are like people saying, well, maybe Salvini will be more favorable, might disrupt a little bit. Clearly, that was not the case. That's not the case. Because why? Clearly, Salvini wanted to have some clashes with the European institutions, but clearly, Brexit was really not the biggest issue for him. He had to choose the battles he wanted to have with the EU, and clearly the Eurozone, the budget, like the national budget or migration, were much more important battles than Brexit. But I think maybe one thing that we underestimate about the unity in the EU in this first phase, in the divorce phase, is Northern Ireland. Because like many people, even in the UK, were saying, yeah, at the end of the day, some member states will come to our side, because at the end of the day, the default position is a hard border. If you have a hard Brexit, if there's no deal, there will be a hard border. So at the end of the day, so is it better to have a no deal and a hard border, or a hard border and a deal? So I say maybe at the end of the day, some member states will finally realize this, and then they will ditch Ireland for bigger reasons, because you know, the famous German car industry, etc., 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 but not only them. So it's quite extraordinary if you think about that. EU member states achieve unity behind Ireland in such a consistent way. All right, having said this introduction, so how did the EU build its position so far? As I said, I'm not going very much into this. In the interviews I did in Brussels, there was a lot in terms of, oh, we constructed an agreement among institutions in the Council, the Commission, the Parliament, etc. So there was the idea of constructing an agreement. But behind this, there was a key role of the Commission and the task force. But what I want to talk about here more in detail is the involvement of the European Parliament in the Brexit negotiations. Because we wrote a paper with two colleagues, Edoardo Bressanelli and Willem Lehmann, and I might report what we found. So basically, this is the famous, infamous Article 50. I'm not going to read it, but the point here is, if you read the article, basically the European Parliament has a role just at the very end. So the European Parliament basically can say, let me see if the exact word. It shall be concluded, the agreement with the departing state, on behalf of the Union by the Council, acting by qualified majority, after obtaining the consent of the European Parliament. That was it. So the European Parliament was supposed to be involved at the very end of the process. There was nothing else in the Article 50. And of course, given that Article 50 was a primer, nobody really knew how to involve and to involve the European Parliament whatsoever throughout the process. So our argument is that the European Parliament was or is still very unlikely to reject the final deal if consulted at the very end of the process. Why? For two reasons. One is a kind of very rational reason. Because if you think about any deal, even the loosest or the weakest deal that the UK and the EU will ever negotiate, is better than a no deal for the European Parliament. So they are presented with a very bad deal and no deal. The European Parliament, 99.9%, would go for no deal. So the threat of the European Parliament voting down is not very credible to us. But the second reason is also that in these situations, over and over, the European Parliament always showed responsibility. They don't want to be seen as the institution that creates this big troubles. You know, the UK and the EU will finally find a solution. Oh, we voted down. For the benefit of Europe, they always act responsibly in these cases. There are examples in the Eurozone crisis where they basically also behave in a similar way. So the point is, if the European Parliament wants to participate or wants to matter a little bit in the process, they had to participate in the negotiations during and throughout the Brexit process. Maybe like the UK Parliament didn't do, but maybe I'll say something later about it. So, as I said, basically, there are basically very few and vague references in the Article 50 about the involvement of the European Parliament. This is a normal situation of so-called incomplete contracts. So what happens when you have incomplete contracts? Clearly, you need to fill out the gap, the void. And the European Parliament has always been doing that. For instance, in trade policy, it did very similar. Say, okay, they had limited powers, and they say, okay, but if you want a deal, you know, we want more institutional powers. And there's like a common story of the European Parliament increasing in its institutional powers over the decades in the EU system. And it sort of did similarly with the Brexit process, because I said there were very few and vague references, but they were able, probably through the consent that they have to give at the end, to increase its powers, and in this case, to increase its involvement in the negotiations themselves. And so what we looked at in the research is mainly 3 areas. So to what extent the European Parliament was able to access information from the Brexit negotiations. Second, to what extent was the European Parliament really involved in the key decisions in the Brexit negotiations? And finally, okay, but did it really influence the Brexit process, or mainly it was happy to stay aside? Okay, as I said, it was not clear. It was not. We should not give for granted that the European Parliament was supposed to be involved as basically it did in the process. Because if we go back to December 16 or January 17, I mean, the member states didn't want the European Parliament to be involved that much. There were like some I would say nasty exchanges between the member states and the European Parliament. There was Schulz said, well, if you don't get us involved, forget about the deal. We're going to vote it down. Tajani then said the same thing. So it was really not like an uncontroversial thing at all. But then Barnier probably learned that it's better to get the European Parliament involved, so we will minimize the risks down the line, and also for a bunch of other reasons that we might maybe discuss in the Q&A. So the European Parliament got the quick support of the Commission and Barnier. So in terms of information, they were pretty much fully informed. Sometimes member states complain, say, well, actually, they got information before us. How is that possible? Some perm reps in Brussels saying not necessarily liking it. And then they were able to participate in the key Brexit decision. I mean, some quotes that basically repeat what I've been saying. So if the European Parliament does not consent, the negotiations come to nothing. Barnier quickly understood that, and he cultivated the relationship with the EP. If you want to make sure that you have a positive result, you want to make sure that the EP has, first of all, no procedural complaints. And it's also what happened, as I said, in the trade negotiations. It's a similar path. The European Parliament threatened, sometimes also once vetoed one trade negotiation, basically because it was not involved. Again, maybe some lessons for the British Parliament. What about influence? Because clearly one thing is participating and the other thing is really influence, especially when you shape decisions outcomes against the will of other actors. Was the European Parliament really able to influence these negotiations? So if you look at the draft negotiation guidelines of the Council, of the European Council and the directives of the Council, and you compare them with the 4 EP's resolutions, clearly they have very similar positions. So it's hard to say, right? But it's, what people were saying, that there's not very much coincidence that these documents are very, very similar, because we say we are constructing an agreement. So for instance, the first EP resolution, I think it was April 2017. Of course, the European Parliament, the Brexit group had seen already the draft guidelines of the European Council, so basically the language was very similar. So they were basically constructing an agreement. The only partial difference is probably, I think it's with the last European Parliament resolution, when especially Verhofstadt wanted to say, okay, we have a template for the UK. It's an association agreement, where the task force and the members, they were really not keen on that, like Ukrainian style. But what we can really say is that the European Parliament had a very selective attention on one big issue, which were EU citizens' rights post-Brexit. They didn't really care about money. They didn't really focus on money, not so much on Northern Ireland. What they really focused on was on citizens' rights. There were a couple of occasions where their intervention also changed the final agreement between the EU and UK. But what was very interesting is that they understood the situation, and they said, so in the Parliament said, we limited our political battles in this case. So we understood that the issue was very important, so we didn't do how we normally do. both internally. So as you know, there was within the parliament there was like a Brexit steering group with with 5 political groups: the EPP, the Socialists, the Greens, the GUE, the Left, and ALDE with the Brexit coordinator, who was which was Verhofstadt. So these 5 political groups internally, they also said, well, we had divergences in these resolutions. You know, sometimes we might have liked this or that. In other circumstances, we would have pressed to change it, but we understood that it's Brexit, so we didn't do it. We behave in that way. The responsibility, so internally, so that they say, okay, but also externally. So even with the other institutions, they say we don't want to press too much the things. We understand that the situation is crucial, very important for the EU. Also showing unity in the EU, so it's very important for us to do it. So we limit our battles, or even with the other institutions as well. As I said, there was a very close relationship between the European Parliament and the Commission. And then sometimes, I will not have time to go into this, but there was also some strategic use on the part of the Commission of the EP. So there was sometimes even the Commission saying to the members of these 5 political groups, why don't you say this in the press? Because we can't say that. But you can do that, you know, so to show also a harder stance vis-à-vis the UK. So there was also a little bit of that interplay. All right, so let's conclude this first part. I'll be very quick. So I will not summarize then what I said so far. And then I will skip, maybe in case we can talk about in the Q&A. So are there any lessons for the UK Parliament or for the UK system here? I said just one thing, is that I asked people in Brussels, especially in the SAD group, did you have any role vis-à-vis the Labour Party? So did you try to convince them to, I don't know, maybe support the deal? And they said, no. Not even the SD say, this is their thing, we didn't we didn't put any pressure on them. Okay, okay, I'll try to be brief then. Okay, that's fine. So the second strand of research is, how did European political parties in Europe react to Brexit? So we looked at right-wing populist parties. You can see Salvini, Le Pen, Wilders on one side. And then how did the mainstream parties react to that? You have Macron here, Merkel, and Gentiloni, who's now the nominated commissioner for economic affairs, which we were discussing yesterday, is an interesting, for me, move. Okay, so Brexit in European Parliament. We looked at 4 cases: the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Italy. The idea is how Brexit was used or not used by parties in Europe, because this is a research which I've been doing with a number of colleagues that I've listed here. So I'm going to show you some general trends, and then maybe I'll say something a little bit more about Italy, because it's the case that I followed a bit more. So how did let's start with the right-wing populist party. How did they react to Brexit? If you look at, pretty much in the aftermath of the referendum, it was really like it was a clear trend. So all these parties, Marine Le Pen, Wilders, Salvini, they were all super happy. Say, okay, now it's our turn. Yes, and then there were like people talking about contagion, also maps of possible contagion, right? And so our starting point is that if the contagion had to happen or was going to happen some ways, it had to start probably from the right-wing populist parties. So, because it's in time of critical events that these parties can politicize the issue, and then they could use Brexit as an external stimulus to increase, maybe intensify their Euroscepticism. So did the populist radical right parties elsewhere treat Brexit as an opportunity to bolster their Euroscepticism? This was our question. And as I said, I summarize here the findings, and it's very common in all the 4 countries. Then we also looked a little bit to other countries as well. But these 4 countries also, we chose them because they had elections in the year basically after the Brexit referendum. So you had the Netherlands in April 17, France in May 17, Germany in September 17, and Italy March 18. So what we wanted to see how it played out, for instance, in national elections, in national campaigns. So as I said, there were very similar dynamics in these 4 countries. So first, as I said, a very initial positive reaction to Brexit. All these parties said, our time is now coming. Talk about Independence Day, historical day, Brexit will follow, etc., etc. But after that, but pretty much immediately, basically Brexit disappeared from the party's agenda and discourse. And crucially, also we looked at the national electoral campaigns. Basically, Brexit was not really mentioned pretty much at all. Only a few cases. Maybe France is the partial exception, but it's the famous case that you might have heard that when between the 2 presidential rounds, then Marine Le Pen decided to downplay their skepticism and say, well, we might not leave the Eurozone. So what we're saying is that, so why did that happen? One easy answer is that clearly, at the same time, there was a bigger issue and probably an easier issue for these parties to focus on, which was a migration crisis. So of course, if you have migration crisis, why do you want to maybe bog down to European issues which might be more divisive? We looked also at the 2019 European Parliament elections, and again, pretty much the situation is very similar. So these parties did not intensify, did not politicicize the European integration more in the Brexit aftermath. They did not even increase the Euroscepticism. If anything, is slightly less, but clearly they didn't drop Euroscepticism too. So I'll just look a little bit at what happened to Italy. So in 2014, for instance, in the European Parliament Lega manifesto, there was like a whole section about the euro. And the euro was described in the manifesto as a criminal error. Again, Salvini reacted as Brexit as a beautiful day. There was like some tweets saying also, this one of the tweets he did on the UK, it was I think in September 2017, saying basically, well, after Brexit, the UK is growing very fast. We should free ourselves from the cage of the European Union, and then we come back to life. Again, here it's very similar what happened, and it's quite interesting, I think, this case, because all the incentives, the Italian public, as you know, is quite Eurosceptic, or relatively Eurosceptic. So there were potential incentives for Salvini to push it much more, but he didn't. So it almost disappeared from the agenda, and it had no role whatsoever in the electoral campaign. But what is interesting is that even during the electoral campaign, Salvini decided not to talk about Europe that much. Probably, he didn't talk about leaving the Eurozone, he didn't talk about leaving the Euro or the EU, so he didn't really talk much about Europe at all. And that's also why one of the reasons, you might not remember this, but there was a moment when the Five Star Movement and Lega government was formed, that they were, especially Salvini, was trying to appoint that guy as finance minister. His name is Savona. It was like very Eurosceptic. He also basically envisaged a sort of plan B to exit from the Eurozone overnight. But the President of the Republic rejected the nominee, the appointment of Savona, on the basis that you might want to do this, like exiting with a plan B, the Eurozone, but you didn't talk about in the electoral campaign. Okay, so what about mainstream parties? again, we looked at the same four countries for the same reasons. What is interesting is that, as I will show also in the case of Italy, but also here there's a sort of quote from the VVD leader in the Netherlands, say, okay, Brexit happens, how did they react? Yeah, there was a little bit of disappointment, of course, from the mainstream parties, but there was like further reflection on Europe is needed. We have to seek a middle way between believers in Europe and those celebrating Brexit. Again, Berlusconi, but also Padoan, who was the Italian finance minister at the time from the Democratic Party, said there's an urgent need to change Europe. So how to react to Brexit? Also because most of these parties was also a little bit under stress and electoral competition. Some of these parties were not doing very well, like the socialists in Germany, but especially in France. So how did they react to Brexit? Did they maybe become a little bit more Eurosceptic, or no? Or they advocated more or less Europe? So I'll try to be brief on these cases. So the Netherlands, I think if we summarize in a very few words, there was a sort of consensus in the Netherlands from all the three parties of the three mainstream parties that we chose. They reacted in a very similar way. They also criticized the EU quite a lot, saying, well, this is a symptom that the EU is not working well. They did everything not to sound too Europhile in the Brexit aftermath, and which positions on Europe have been they advocating? A slimmer Europe, no grand reforms, and definitely very little appetite for a social Europe, with a partial exception, but not that much from the PVDA. What about Germany? Here you can see kind of large party differences. CDU with more Eurosceptic positions, with also focusing on anti-migration measures, but not to give too many competence to the EU, and definitely not social Europe. SPD instead, kind of more social democratic language, so more redistribution, so no austerity, more redistribution, more competence to the EU and EP. What about France? Here we looked at three parties, so the Socialists, the Republicans, and Macron. Again, here you had the socialists conveying the usual social democratic message, like more European policies, yes, but we have to criticize the deficit criteria. Probably we need to invest more. Europe should allow to invest more for the member states. The Republicans are still, this Gaullist heritage is still very much present. They were really saying we should end Schengen. That was the main message. We should end Schengen. And they were kind of schizophrenic in terms of the macroeconomic stances. Balanced budget, but more spending. It was a bit strange. And then you had Macron with his message, certainly a pro-European message, but also a very protectionist message in terms of Europe is there to protect us from globalization, from all these nasty things that we have in the world. And what about, so like I said, Italy. I looked at the Democratic Party and Forza Italia. And then immediately after Brexit, again, a lot of criticism towards the EU, even from the Democratic Party. Even from the Democratic Party, Renzi was saying, well, you know, Brexit might also turn out a very positive event if we change Europe as I'm telling you to do. Berlusconi was very critical too, say, you know, this is a symptom that our generation's dream, the European integration, is failing before our eyes. So they reacted. They reacted, you know, saying, well, Europe is not working, we have to change it urgently, immediately. And then, so this is like some graphs showing the party position, Italian party position on the EU. You can see the Democratic Party at the top, more pro-European. But Renzi really changed a little bit also the narrative around Europe. The Democratic Party used to be like, you know, it still is the stronghold of pro-Europeanism, but Renzi also changed the narrative. Most of Italian problems are because of Europe, not because of internal Italian problems. But what is interesting is what what do Forza Italia and Democratic Party advocate for Europe? It's again a very similar message between the two. So they say, yeah, no fiscal compact. Let's get rid of that. You know, these Germans convinced us to do the fiscal compact. It was a very bad idea. It's not something for us. No austerity policies. We need to spend more. And then basically, the message of the Democratic Party is not that different. So more Europe, we want to have a social Europe, like a social democratic message. So we have to have a Eurozone budget for social spending, more investments at the national level, etc., etc. So I conclude. How can we conclude that? Say, right-wing populist parties, there was a celebration of Brexit and then kind of a disappearance of Brexit. And there was really no evidence of intensifying or politicizing Europe more or intensifying Euroscepticism more. What about mainstream parties? Surprisingly or not, they were quite critical of the current EU in the aftermath of Brexit. Say, yeah, we have to, basically all these parties, we have to reform it. But the point is, they have, as you could see, they have very different agendas. You have differences along left and right parties. In Germany, you have SPD and CDU, for instance, but also in France to a certain extent. But then also a north-south divide. You know, the Dutch are very clear. No social Europe, no grand vision. In Italy, the message is very different. No, we need to have a social Europe now. Europe is not just about bankers and this kind of populist narrative that you can find elsewhere. So I stop here.